Good morning and welcome to FPF's webinar on de-identification in education, part 2 of this week's exciting webinar series on the most fascinating of topics for most of us, I know. I'm really excited that all of you are joining us and hoping that you will find today's presentation useful and enlightening. And we have two awesome speakers, Michael Hawes from the U.S. Department of Education and Adrian Peoples from the Department of Ed in Delaware, to talk about de-identification, both following the law, best practices, and I cannot think of two people who are better to talk about this topic. If you missed our presentation on de-identification 101 on Wednesday and are interested in having the recording or notes from that, we would be happy to send them to you. Just send me an email at avamps@fpf.org. If you had registered for Wednesday's meeting, you don't need to send me an email, just if you did not register. With that, I am now going to turn things over to Michael Hawes from the U.S. Department of Ed to begin today's presentation. Michael, it is up to you.
Great, thank you, Amelia. So good morning, everyone. As Amelia said, my name is Michael Hawes. I'm the Director of Student Privacy Policy at the U.S. Department of Education. In that role, I oversee all of our policy development work, and I oversee our Privacy Technical Assistance Center, which provides technical assistance on issues relating to privacy and security to schools, school districts, state departments of education, colleges and universities, and increasingly to the broader education community as well. I'll give some information about PTAC's resources towards the end of my presentation. So we're going to talk today about de-identification in the education context, and that's a subject that is very tricky at times, as I'm sure many of you are aware. So I'll cover kind of what de-identification means for education data, some common pitfalls that those agencies and institutions and other entities that are trying to de-identify education data often run into. We'll cover some tools that you can use, some techniques that you can use to de-identify education data, and then I'll cover some resources that are available to you through us. So for starters, I always have to ask the first question, which is, what is PII, personally identifiable information? When you ask people to describe or define PII, the first thing that comes to mind is personal information, things that directly identify an individual, in this case, Captain Hook. It's a name, we all know who Captain Hook is, but PII, personally identifiable information, is more than just that obvious personal information that we often think of. And that's where the personally identifiable information component often comes into play. So in this case, we've gotten rid of his name, but we have a description here: a one-handed pirate with an irrational fear of crocodiles and ticking clocks. We haven't mentioned the name of the individual here, but anybody who's familiar with the story of Peter Pan knows that we are referring to Captain Hook here. We've identified him through this identifiable information. So whenever we're talking about PII, we have to remember that it's about identifiable information, not just the personal information that we often think of. Every privacy law out there defines PII slightly differently. And I always joke, if you ask 10 privacy professionals to define PII, you'll get at least 15 definitions. And FERPA has its own kind of unique definition, and it's a rather expansive one. It includes, under the statute and the regulations, it includes the obvious candidates, your direct identifiers, things that have a one-to-one relationship to a particular student, so name, social security number, student ID number, that sort of thing. It includes indirect identifiers, those data elements that have a one-to-many relationship to a student, things like birth dates, various demographic information, geographical context, that sort of thing. But FERPA's definition of PII goes further than that and includes in the definition any other information that either by itself or when combined with other information is linked or linkable to a specific student, and that would allow a reasonable person in the school community who doesn't have personal knowledge of the student's records to identify the student with any reasonable certainty. And so there's several reasonables in there, and we can talk more about that a little later. But the key takeaway from this kind of last criteria here is that just about any information about a student can be personally identifiable depending on the context. So there's no defined list of data elements that are or are not PII. You have to think about all of the information and whether any of it could be linked back to the student and could be used to re-identify them. So PII under FERPA is a very expansive definition, and that's often what makes things so challenging when we attempt to de-identify education data. I should mention, and this ties in with that definition, FERPA has a confidentiality standard, and it's can a reasonable person in the school community re-identify the individual with reasonable certainty. Now that's going to mean different things in different contexts, and it's going to mean different things depending on the type of data that you're seeking to de-identify. So with tabular data, when you're discussing aggregate tabular data, generally speaking, that reasonable person standard requires that there be at least a small degree of uncertainty, some element of reasonable doubt in order to sufficiently protect the privacy of individuals. We often use what we call the rule of three, which is if you can't differentiate one student from two other similarly situated students, then you've probably introduced enough reasonable doubt. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. It's about risk assessment, and we'll talk more about that later. But this is a good rule of thumb to at least begin your analysis of your attempts at de-identification with. If you're looking at individual level data, on the other hand, it's often much trickier. Because individual level data, particularly if it's longitudinal data that tracks a student over time, you have a whole lot more data points about the individual available, and those data points together can make it much easier to triangulate back to a specific student. So when you're attempting to de-identify individual level data, you need to be much more thorough because the risk of re-identification is much higher. So for today's discussion, we're going to focus mostly on tabular data, but many of the tools and many of the pitfalls that I'm going to talk about later apply equally to individual level data. You just have to be a little bit more thorough. I should mention, for those of you who are familiar with de-identification in other contexts, we often get the question, well, does FERPA have a safe harbor provision like HIPAA, the Health Insurance Privacy and Portability Act? HIPAA, with their safe harbor, established a list of data elements that if you remove them from a data file, produce a resulting data set that is deemed to be de-identified. There is no similar safe harbor provision under FERPA, largely because one of the elements that HIPAA includes in their safe harbor framework is an element of geographical aggregation. You're not allowed to, under the safe harbor framework, you're not allowed to pinpoint any geographic information with more specificity than the first 3 digits of zip code. That's intended to make sure that you have a sufficiently large underlying population to make triangulation back to a specific individual harder. In education data, because we're so often interested in what's happening within a specific school or within a specific district, we have that geographic precision kind of built into the data. And so having a safe harbor framework like HIPAA has doesn't really work the same way. So short answer, there is no safe harbor framework under FERPA the way there is under HIPAA. Now you might ask, well, we're talking PII. I don't have any PII. I just want to release aggregate data. And I hear that a lot. People say, oh, I'll de-identify the data by aggregating it. Well, the problem is that aggregate data often still contain PII if they report information on small subgroups or groups of individuals that have unique or uncommon characteristics. Even when you're aggregating data, if you've got those small groups built in, you can still often pinpoint that back to specific individuals. So even if it's aggregate data, it often still contains PII in the education context. So how are states protecting privacy in their publicly reported data? Well, under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, formerly No Child Left Behind, now the Every Student Succeeds Act, but under ESEA, states in the early 2000s started adopting minimum N size rules that they use to protect student privacy in their aggregate reported data. But there was substantial variation across the country in how states implemented this. This table is from roughly 2012, and it shows the distribution of minimum N size rules that states were using at the time. There were a few states on the lower end that had minimum N size rules of 5. There were some all the way at the top that had minimum N size rules of 30, but many states, the majority of them, adopted an N size rule of 10, that they wouldn't report data on subgroups smaller than 10. But even within this distribution here, there was really substantial variation in how states were conceiving of that minimum N size rule and how they were implementing it. And we'll see some of that as we go through some of these examples. At the end of the day, I remember my definition of the concerns about PII and aggregate data are that if you're reporting on small subgroups or individuals with unique characteristics, that can still be PII. Small cells are where your biggest risks are for re-identification. But just suppressing or treating those small cells is typically not sufficient to protect privacy, and I'll show you why. So here are some common mistakes that we see in public reporting, and these examples are all taken from state websites as part of their school report cards. And I've taken off the identifying state information to protect the innocent, so to speak. But these are actual examples of mistakes that are commonly made when trying to de-identify data for public publication. The first gets at one of the big differences in how states interpret a minimum N size rule. So let's say this state has a minimum N size rule of 5 students. So in this case, you've got a subgroup that has 6 students that were tested. So the subgroup size meets the state's minimum N size rule. They then report that 1 student was proficient, or 16.7% of those 6 students. Well, this is a problem, and this could divulge personally identifiable information, because what if you're that 1 student? If you're that 1 student who was proficient, you now know that all 5 of the other students in your subgroup, whom you probably know, were not proficient, and you've learned something about them. You've been able to re-identify them and the content of their education records. So in this case, the difference in kind of interpreting what an N size rule means led to the possibility for re-identification because this particular state was implementing that N size rule at the population size versus the cell size. Another common mistake that we see deals with extreme values. So a lot of times, if you've got either all students or no students, or close to all of the students or close to none of the students falling in a particular outcome category, you need to protect the privacy of those students. You need to do something to prevent people from knowing, oh, okay, 100% of students or 0% of students fell into a particular outcome that would be identifiable. So you see frequently states adopting a top and bottom threshold for reporting, where they'll say, instead of saying 0% or instead of saying 1 student, they'll say less than 5%, or they'll say greater than 95% instead of saying 100%. Well, this is an example of this. There were 8 students tested. They suppressed the number of proficient students and then reported that extreme value bottom-coded to less than 5%. Very commonly used threshold there. Well, the problem with this is, okay, 0 out of 8 students is 0%. 1 out of 8 students is 12.5%. So reporting that less than 5% of the students were proficient is exactly the same mathematically as saying 0 students were proficient. So even though they suppressed the number and even though they had a top and bottom threshold put into place, they didn't protect privacy, because you're still able to infer from this 0 students from that subgroup were proficient, and you now know something about all 8 of them. A better way for handling these extreme values is to vary the thresholds that you use for this top and bottom coding by the size of the subgroup that you're reporting on. So look at the size of your denominator and adjust the width of those top and bottom thresholds depending on how large that underlying population is. So if you've got a small number of students, say between 6 and 15 students, you're going to need to use a rather extreme top and bottom coding threshold of less than 50% or greater than or equal to 50% in order to guarantee that you have sufficient students that could be in each category to protect privacy. But the larger that denominator gets, the more precise you can be, up to the point where if you have more than 300 students, you can be reporting in whole number percentages. Or if you've got over 3,000 students, you can report to a single decimal place, because each of those percentage thresholds then guarantees that you have at least 3 students in the bottom code or in the top code, and that is sufficient to protect privacy within those reported extreme values. Okay, here's another common mistake. If you look at this series of numbers and you try to figure out what the missing number there is, you can't. You have no idea. But if you know what the total of all the numbers is, it becomes a simple math problem. You just subtract out the reported numbers from the total, and you know what the missing value is. This is one that we see a lot. And a common way that states and schools try to protect the number that was missing in this case is, okay, you suppress the small number and you suppress the total. Without the total, you can't subtract out the other reported values, and you have no idea what the other missing value is. But the problem with education data is that oftentimes data are reported in multiple ways. So for example, if that original list of numbers was students by subgroup, let's say race and ethnicity, well, even if you don't report the total across all the racial and ethnic groups, you still probably know the total from data that are reported elsewhere. For example, your total across racial and ethnic subgroups is probably going to be the same as your total of students reported by gender. So not publishing totals is not generally sufficient to protect any cells that you might be suppressing for privacy concerns. So this is a very common mistake that we see, and here's an example of it. In this case, there were 2 subgroups in a school, one that met the state's minimum men's size requirement and one that did not. So this particular state did not publish data on the subgroup that didn't meet that threshold, but they published data on the other subgroup. Well, because the data for all students was reported, it becomes a simple matter to compare the numbers, do a little bit of math, and you know that, okay, in subgroup 2 that had 1 student, that student performed at the basic level. It's really simple to subtract out the reported subgroup or subgroups from the reported totals and find out what the suppressed value is. So in this case, what this particular state would need to do is they would need to do something to the data reported for subgroup 1 as well as the data reported for subgroup 2 in order to prevent somebody from recalculating the value for that 1 student in subgroup 2. So the real trouble that we see with cell size rules as they're commonly implemented is that it's not just the small values. It's not just those small subgroups that are important to consider. Larger cells, larger values can also be disclosive if they're extreme values, that is, if they're close to 0% or close to 100% of the students in a group, or if those larger values can be used to calculate the values of protected cells that are elsewhere in your data, either in the same table or even in another table or another data release that you're doing. All of these data are interconnected, and oftentimes it's very simple to subtract out reported values from data that are reported elsewhere to arrive at the data that you're trying to protect. One of my favorite things to do when I'm going out into the field to do disclosure avoidance trainings is I'll go onto a state website right before my presentation and try to break it, try to break their privacy protections by looking at their reported data. And in many cases, it's a simple matter of just a few minutes to find an example where I can completely undo the suppressions or the privacy protections that they've put into place in their reported data tables, because these data are all interconnected, and you can often kind of reverse engineer what those reported cells or what those unreported cells actually were. So what's the take-home point on this? You have to consider all of the different ways that the data are being sliced and diced, all the different ways they're being reported. In education data, we often report our information in a multidimensional structure. We report at the subgroup level, we report at the grade level, at the school level, at the district level, at the state level, in different ways. And the more we slice and dice by different characteristics, the more those data can be used to infer or deduce values that are protected in one or more of your tables. So in order to be effective, any de-identification methodology that you want to use has to consider all the different ways that the data are being aggregated, all the different ways that they're being reported. You can't just look at one table in a vacuum. You have to think about all the different tables, all the different ways you're publishing the information at once. So looking back at this example, lack of complementary suppression, they didn't do anything to the subgroup 1 data. We have to look at all the different levels that we're reporting. So subgroup, grade, school, district, state, nationally. If any cell, if any value is suppressed, either as a primary suppression or a complementary suppression in one of your tables, well, then you need to make sure that it's suppressed in at least one other reported entity at the next level of aggregation. So if you're suppressing 7th grade African-American students in school A, you need to make sure that you're suppressing 7th grade African-American students in another school as well in order to then report the district information. Because otherwise you could subtract out the other school's data from the district data and arrive back at what had been the suppressed cell value. And it gets even more complicated because any additional suppressions that you put in these other levels of reporting also have to have their own complementary suppressions as well. You end up with what I often call Swiss cheese data because each suppression has to be followed up with another suppression in the row, another suppression in the column frequently in order to prevent the ability to recalculate your suppressed values. And it can get very complicated very fast the more you're reporting at different levels. So this is not easy. It can be very tricky. This is typically where we see states or districts making mistakes in their privacy protections. Another take-home point is you have to consider data that are being released by others. So whenever you're performing your disclosure risk analysis, you can't just think about the data that you're reporting. You have to think about the fact that other entities out there may be reporting on the same or similar data as well. So if you're a school district, you also have to take into consideration how your state Department of Education is releasing those same data, or how the US Department of Education is releasing those same data. Or if you have arrangements with external researchers, you have to think about how they would be publishing these data. All of those different data releases of the same data influence the re-identifiability of the data that you're seeking to publish. So you have to think about this very holistically about how everyone that is using these same data are publishing them together. So what are your options here? This gets very tricky very fast. What are the options that are available to you to de-identify education data when faced with these challenges? Well, there are three basic flavors of disclosure avoidance techniques. Suppression, which we've talked a little bit about already. Blurring, which we've also talked a little bit about, and I'll explain about that more in a minute, and perturbation. So suppression involves removing data from the data that you're looking to publish in order to prevent the re-identification of individuals that are either in small cells or that have some unique characteristics. And there's different ways of doing suppression. Cell suppression, which we've talked about, row suppression, where you might be suppressing an entire subgroup, sampling, where you're only publishing on a subset of the data. These are all different types of suppression methodologies. What effect do they have on the resulting data? Well, I mentioned the Swiss cheese effect, for example. All of that complementary suppression, suppressing not just the cell you're trying to protect, but additional cells to prevent against recalculation of that suppressed value, often results in a lot of holes in your resulting data tables. So you get a lot of asterisks, if you will, if you're using asterisks in place of your suppressed cells. And more than that, if you're really interested in the performance of small subgroups, suppression methodologies will generally hit you pretty hard in terms of the usability of the resulting data. Because if the small subgroups are what you're interested in, well, they're the ones that are probably going to be the first data points that are being suppressed under any suppression methodology. So it generally results in very little data being available for small populations that may be the targets of your educational interventions. There's also a substantial risk of disclosure even with suppressed data because it's often very difficult to perform complementary suppression properly because the data are being sliced and diced in so many different ways, because they're being reported by different entities with different disclosure avoidance methodologies. It can become a very simple matter to just recalculate any of your suppressed values. So the residual risk of disclosure can be very high. Another flavor of disclosure avoidance techniques is what I call blurring. And I put this in quotation marks because the term blurring in the disclosure avoidance literature means different things depending on where you're discussing it. For this context, I use blurring to mean any method that reduces the precision of the data that you're reporting in order to introduce uncertainty and reduce the ability to re-identify individuals with any degree of accuracy. Examples of blurring techniques include various types of aggregation, reporting your data in percentages instead of counts, reporting your data in ranges, either range of counts or range of percentages, top and bottom coding, which we talked about before to protect those extreme values. Rounding can be an example of blurring. These are all ways of introducing uncertainty by reducing the precision of the data that you're publishing. Now, this has an impact on data utility as well. So if you are using blurring methodologies, it can result in data that make it difficult to make inferences about small changes over time. So again, if you're interested in how a small subgroup is performing, let's say graduation rates, and you want to see, okay, have they improved from time period A to time period B? Well, if you're rounding your data, for example, if you're rounding to the nearest 5 or 10%, then an increase of 2 or 3%, which could be important, is going to get washed out in that uncertainty that you've added. So it can make observing small changes in small groups difficult over time. There's also some residual risk of re-identification. Blurring methodologies are generally lower risk compared to some of the alternatives. But if you have row and column totals that are available and you haven't applied blurring to those row and column totals as well, then oftentimes you can essentially back into what the actual values are, even within a range or a rounded reported value, just by knowing what the totals are. So there is still some residual risk of disclosure there. The third major family of disclosure avoidance techniques are what I call perturbation. And this involves actually making small changes to the data in one way or another, again, to introduce uncertainty, to introduce that reasonable doubt. And there are examples here, things like data swapping. It's more common for individual level data. The introduction of noise or margins of error, creation of synthetic data that mirror the properties of the original data, but that are not actually representing real people, so to speak, or a whole new kind of family of techniques that has gained prominence recently, which is called differential privacy. We're seeing that being used a lot in the technology sector, for example. Perturbative methods are very popular, particularly among statistical agencies, because they result in data that are scientifically very valid. You can still draw the same inferences, you can still draw the same types of analytical conclusions from perturbed data that you would be able to from the raw, unprotected data. So statistical agencies like this because they can publish very usable data that researchers find very valuable. But because it relies on making changes to the underlying data in order to protect privacy, we often see resistance to perturbative methods in the accountability side of the house, because people may see kind of making those changes, the introduction of that noise or the swapping of data points as inappropriate, because it's reducing the transparency and credibility of the underlying data. So you can't know for certain that a school had 93% graduation rates because the underlying data were tweaked to protect privacy. So from a transparency and accountability standpoint, there's often a lot of resistance to perturbative methods. Perturbed data are generally very low risk from a re-identification standpoint, because that reasonable doubt, because that uncertainty is essentially baked in to the publication. But if somebody has access to some of the original data, they can figure out what your specific perturbation parameters were, and they might be able to use that to essentially reverse engineer the original data for other entities than their own. So there is still some risk here, but is generally considered to be a relatively low risk disclosure avoidance technique. So another take-home point on this, the method that you choose, which disclosure avoidance method you select to apply to your data in order to de-identify it, really matters. There are a lot of different types of methods that are out there, and there's limitless variations in the parameters that you can use and how you apply them. But each technique, each method, each selection of a parameter has an impact on the usability of the data. It can result in greater or lesser coverage across subgroups. It can result in greater or lesser precision in the data. It can result in greater or lesser transparency or accountability. So all of these techniques have different impacts on how third parties will be able to use the data that you're publishing. And we're publishing data for a reason. We have data users out there who use the data for specific things. So the very first question we should ask ourselves when deciding, okay, we're going to publish this education data, we're going to put it out on our website, the first thing you should ask is, how are these data going to be used? Because knowing the answer to that helps you select the method or methods that will maximize that utility, maximize that usability of the resulting data, while simultaneously protecting privacy under the law. So what are some tips that you can consider here? Well, the first is you don't have to pick just a single method. You can actually adopt multiple methods or hybrids of methods that complement each other. So you can, instead of using exclusively complementary suppression, you can use a combination of suppression and blurring, where you're introducing a little bit of uncertainty and suppressing some of your small cells together in a way that does enough to protect privacy while maintaining enough coverage and enough precision of the resulting data. If you do choose to use suppression as a methodology, be especially wary of how you're treating your row and column totals and how you are reporting data in related data tables or how others are reporting those data, because complementary suppression will likely be necessary, again, to prevent against recalculation of those underlying values. I strongly recommend that you don't rely on suppression of underlying population or subgroup counts as a method of de-identification, largely because those underlying counts, like the number tested, for example, are often either known, reported elsewhere, or can be inferred. So complementary suppression is your friend here, versus trying to suppress a single subgroup and not reporting the total for all students, because that often results in the ability to recalculate from data reported elsewhere. When you're reporting data in percentages, at a minimum, you should be rounding to whole numbers whenever possible. I see a lot of times where states are reporting percentages to 2 decimal places, for example, with small numbers of students in the underlying populations. That gives you an exact student count. Just simple math, you can reverse that to the student count that it was derived from. Be really careful when you're doing individual level data. It's all the challenges that we see in protecting privacy in aggregate tabular data are compounded exponentially when you're dealing with individual level data because there are so many more data points. So always look very carefully at individual data when designing and implementing a disclosure avoidance strategy, because all of these concerns get multiplied and it becomes much easier to triangulate back to individual students. Almost all releases of individual level data will require some degree of perturbation as a disclosure avoidance method, in addition possibly to suppression of certain values or suppression of certain records. You're going to need to have a much more sophisticated methodology to protect privacy in individual level data. And lastly, the big tip here, design your strategy, implement your strategy, and then audit your results. Once you've designed it all and implemented it all, try to break it. Have people who know what the challenges with the identification are, look at your resulting data tables, look at your resulting publications, and see if they can undo the protections that you've put in place. Because a lot of times the rules that you have to implement can be complicated, they can be complex, and the transition from the design of the methodology to the coding and implementation can often lead to simple mistakes that result in the data not being sufficiently protected. So always look at the resulting data that you're looking to publish and see if you can reverse engineer it. This is something that can be a lifesaver when you're going to publish it, because you'll notice, oh my gosh, we made a really stupid mistake there, hidden in the code. And the result was that the data weren't sufficiently protected. I see this quite frequently. So always audit your results. It's a good kind of last step in the protection process. So what does all this mean? There's no such thing as a perfect de-identification strategy. No data can be perfectly de-identified. Anytime we release any data in any form that are derived from individual information, there is always going to be some risk of re-identification. The only way to completely eliminate that risk would be to never publish any data at all. And that's not an option. We have an obligation to publish these data in many cases. So the real thing here is it's about risk. Disclosure avoidance as a process is about assessing the risk of re-identifiability in any data, measuring that risk against your organization's kind of risk threshold or against statutory or regulatory requirements, and then evaluating whether you have sufficiently mitigated that risk to bring it under that acceptability threshold. And if you haven't, then adjusting your disclosure avoidance methods to introduce a little more privacy, to introduce enough added protection to bring that risk within an acceptable framework. So you're not here alone. Again, I said this is very complicated, and it is, but there are a number of resources out there that can help you. The U.S. Department of Education, my office, we have the Privacy Technical Assistance Center, PTAC, and we've got a number of resources there that can assist you in identifying where the pitfalls are and identifying what techniques are available. We've got issue briefs, checklists, FAQs, we've got some case studies, all available on our website at studentprivacy.ed.gov. We also operate a help desk. If you have specific questions or if you want another set of eyes on your disclosure avoidance methodology, definitely send it in. We're happy to review through it. We can't give it a stamp of approval because, again, federal law establishes some requirements, but responsibility for meeting those rests with the disclosing entity. Plus, you may have state or local laws on top of that that may increase that threshold that you have to meet. But we are absolutely willing to review it for best practices, to make recommendations for improving your strategies, to identify if there's any vulnerabilities there that you might not have realized. We are certainly happy to assist in review of your methodologies. We also have some specific resources on disclosure avoidance. We've got an FAQ on disclosure avoidance techniques. We've got an overview of de-identification terms and a case study looking at how this can be implemented at different levels. Again, we have resources there to help. This is not an easy subject to master. We're all kind of grappling with the challenges that we face, meeting public reporting requirements while simultaneously protecting privacy. It's always a give and take there, but you're not alone. Everyone else is facing these challenges, and there are resources there to help. So with that, Amelia, I don't know if we want to turn it over to Adrian right away or do questions first. I leave that up to you.
We will go ahead and go to Adrian in the last about 20 minutes of today's presentation will be questions. So thank you so much, Michael. Adrian, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and I have unmuted you now.
Okay, so perfect. You should be seeing a presentation in slideshow mode. Do you see that?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. Okay, so and one more question: is Michael muted?
I am muted currently. Yes.
Okay. All right. So, okay, for those of you who are listening who are muted, Michael is probably going to want to burst in and say several things during this presentation as we shift from theory and to practice. So I'm going to talk to you about de-identification in practice at the Department of Education here in Delaware, and also talk a little bit about disclosure avoidance in practice as we do it here in Delaware as well, using an example that fortunately Michael has had a chance to look at. I've scaled that back a little bit for the purposes of this webinar. So welcome. My name is Adrian Peoples, and I am the lead education associate for data reporting and governance here at the Delaware Department of Education. So most of the public reporting goes through my office and my team of data folks who sweat the details as these numbers get released to the public and used for all types of research and public activism and so on. So I'm going to first talk about data de-identification and how we use it here at the department in Delaware. So the first thing to note, as soon as I get to the right screen here, is that there are so many identifiers, right? So here at the department, we collect a lot of data. We get data from the LEAs. We get data from education technology vendors. We get data from other state agencies. for the Department of Health and Social Services, for example, as well as systems that we develop that collect their own data around students. So there's a lot of data that comes into the department. If it's student level data, most of those data that we collect come with their own unique identifier for a student. So in some cases, we have 6, 7, 8 different identifiers for a student, and they're all coming into the system and sitting in our longitudinal data warehouse. So the question is when we start reporting data out and we want to de-identify these students, for those requests that are asking for student level data, how do we do it? Well, for us, what we wind up doing is we create what we call a master person index, and we use person as opposed to student because we do the same thing for educators when we're reporting educator data as we do when we report student data. So we create a master person index for every person that we're tracking in the system. And then we map that master person index to all of the various unique identifiers for a student using a very complex algorithm in order to make sure that we are uniquely identifying the same student who's appearing across multiple systems. We do audit checks on that algorithm at least twice a year. So far, we are at a 97.8% match rate, which is outstanding given the number of students we have. And of course, we are a small state, so scale that up to much larger states, and you can see how problematic this could become. But we are continually working to try to get to 100%, which we know is a very aggressive goal. So the technique that we're using, the real nerdy technical term is pseudonymization. So basically providing a pseudonym or an alias for a student and using that as an ID that while we map it back to their original IDs, we do not disclose that mapping in any way. So what does that allow us to do? It allows us to do a couple of things. One, for data requests that we get from researchers that ask for de-identified data, it allows us to send an identifier that is de-identified, that if we get secondary requests or long-term study requests or multi-year requests, allows us to connect that same identifier with that same student across a long period of time. So that's advantage number one. Advantage number two, which you see depicted here, is it allows us to then, through this master person index, connect multiple systems together. So if we've got health data from one system, achievement data from another system, and we can connect the same student and produce a data set that has both health and achievement data in it, and push those out together using the master person index. So if we wanted to measure longitudinally how are our early learners, our children that are before the pre-K world, how are they doing when they arrive in third grade? Well, the early childhood system has their own unique identifier, and then the K-12 system has their own unique identifier. But we have mapped those with a master person index so that we can begin to make the connection of you went through the pre-K system in Delaware, you're now a third grader, you've been tested. We can now start to do some analyses on your performance and how it relates to the early childhood services that you received, and make that connection and then start to do some analysis on that. So it allows us to connect multiple systems together, allowing us to create a more holistic picture of a student, follow them long-term, see multiple sides to them, and go from there. So that's the way that we have de-identified students in Delaware. That's the approach that we've used. But while it has advantages, it does have a few drawbacks. There are three that I can think of. First of all, our match rates are less than 100%. So that does lead to the possibility of having duplicate master person indices for the same student. As you can imagine, if you come into the system with name changes or hyphenated names versus non-hyphenated names, birth dates whose years have been transposed, and so on, it's very possible that you could be in reality talking about the same student, but get two different master person indices for that student. The second thing, and Michael talked about this a little bit, in order to try to avoid re-identification based upon the de-identification that we've done, we could wind up sending out incomplete data sets. Right. So yes, Michael is right. He mentioned it. FERPA doesn't have a safe harbor provision in it like HIPAA does. So if we try to emulate that by removing key demographics from the data set, knowing that we could still uniquely identify the student, we wind up sending out incomplete data sets, data sets with missing school information or missing demographic information or missing both of those in order to prevent re-identification. And then, of course, that limits the types of studies that you can do. The third thing is that re-identification, yes, is possible. Right. So if there is only one Asian American student in school A, no matter how many times I de-identify that student, if I send a data set out that has race and ethnicity as a part of its data set, then I have identified that student, even though I've given them a de-identified identifier. So it's not perfect, The methodology that we've chosen has its drawbacks to it, but it does, in some ways, keep us from sending out real student IDs and real educator IDs in our data sets, in our data requests for data. And so with that, I'm going to transition into disclosure avoidance and make our shifts in that realm. And I'm just going to start with an example report. Miranda, this example report, as you can see, is totally fictitious. We've got three categories: not nice, okay, and nice. We've got four race, ethnicity-based demographics, and of course, two gender-based demographics in this cell. I did check, all the numbers do add up vertically and horizontally, and that took longer than I thought it would to make that happen. But this is just a simple example, and it really brings to light some of the things that Michael was talking about when it relates to the complexities of trying to adequately avoid disclosure while still producing a valuable report for the consumer. So here's our sample report. The first thing I want to talk about is algebra, right? So there were a few slides in Michael's presentation that talked about, ranges and, depending upon the cell size of the population, what type of top and bottom coding could you use? Well, this is an algebraic representation of that slide, right? And so we are, based upon the number of students you have in your population versus the number of students you have in your cell, this is what it could look like. Now I'm going to move on to an example. So for example, if my population size was 30 and my threshold was 15, anything below 15 we would suppress, but you would see that you would start suppressing data at 16.7%. Your bottom coding would be 16.7%. Your top coding would be 83.3%. And then you see bottom coding for numbers, and anything in the middle you can show. And just as Michael pointed out in his slides, as the cell sizes get larger, your top and bottom coding will change as well. So if I have a population of 500, then I can suppress at 1%. or greater than 99%, depending upon the values that you have set. So we have been working with the U.S. Department of Education and PTAC to try to generate these types of slides for us. They're great training tools for us as we have turnover in our policy staff as well as our data staff. And this helps us begin to implement these types of techniques actually into our data. So we constantly call or email the U.S. Department of Ed and PTAC and ask them to look at things. They are very gracious in reviewing them, getting back and getting our feedback. Yes, the example I'm about to show you, we sent to the U.S. Department of Ed. Yes, they did break it really quickly and said, yes, you've got problems here with this training tool. You're going to have to do some work on it. So we went back and did some work, added some demographics, changed some things around. And so I can personally attest that if you need some help with your disclosure avoidance and your de-identification strategies, the U.S. Department of Ed and PTAC are there for you. So let's talk about our original example, which I will go back to here. So if we wanted to apply disclosure avoidance techniques to this data set, there's a lot of things that we can do. Now, in my presentation, this thing is several slides long, but I wanted to just kind of give you some of the highlights. So we focused on the Hispanic cell. We see the population for the Hispanic cell is less than our threshold. In our case, our threshold example is 15. So we would apply disclosure avoidance techniques to this row because the entire population is less than threshold. So we would suppress or bottom code or top code this data because of the fact that the entire population is less than our threshold. But there are other things that we can do as well. It leads into some of the things that Michael was talking about as it relates to reverse engineering. But in the end, we can go from this to this, which is removing the population, which Michael has said is, of course, not enough, and then starting applying all kinds of things. So we started bottom coding, we did some suppression, we did some blurring, and note that without the blurring, we could do some reverse engineering because of the fact that we have male and female in the same report. But this is not the only way to suppress this report. And Michael, if you're screaming up and down right now, just hold on. You could also do it this way, right? So in this example, we kept the population size, so you know how many students are in each demo, but we did some demographic or column-based aggregation and combined the not nice and okay categories into a new category called less than nice, right? And so that allowed us to combine the counts and then apply our techniques of bottom coding and suppression and blurring to that set. So that is another way that this could be done. Third way that this could be done is to do some demographic aggregation, right? So combine your African American, Hispanic, and Asian American demographics to a new demographic called non-white, and then compare those to whites, and then keep your male and female demographics as well, and then apply bottom coding or blurring or top coding as well. And so there are lots of techniques that can apply. Once you apply them, you're going to get all kinds of different ways to look at these reports. But Michael's right. You've got to determine what your strategy is going to be. Once you determine what your strategy is going to be, apply it, and then try to break it. So we did 2 out of the 3, sent this example to the U.S. Department of Ed. They broke it quickly, and then we had to go back in and think about how we were applying it. And this example is something that we're trying to apply to our public reporting architecture so that we can keep track of both unsuppressed and disclosed data sets at the same time. So the last slide that I want to talk about is the challenges to disclosure avoidance. So one of the big challenges is saving and reusing non-disclosive data. Now, in practice, up until this very phone conversation, we spend most of our time applying disclosure avoidance techniques in Excel. And we go through all the machinations of avoiding disclosure, and then that final data set gets saved as a PDF and then deployed. So if we ever wanted to reproduce that report or use that report in some other context, it becomes very challenging to do so. So we're trying to work on saving and then allowing us to reuse our non-disclosive data in a more permanent and user-friendly format. So that is a challenge, because you don't know the final form of the report that you're using. And so just like you saw 3 different examples of ways to avoid disclosure in our original report, where do you save those 3 different examples? And do you save them at the demographic level, which means you're creating new demos and creating new categories to save this data? Or do you do something different? And so that's one of the challenges that we're trying to overcome now. Audience cross-contamination. So we do a lot of public reporting of data and apply our data disclosure avoidance techniques to that data for a very specific audience, right? Then it turns out that, an audience member that's consuming that data is also serving in another role in the state and wants to see data in a different way, right? So an LEA administrator, for example, has access to data for his LEA. We start reporting LEA data to that administrator, but they've also consumed the public report, and now they're using those two in concert to unravel the public report. And so that we run into that problem, and that's a hurdle that we're constantly trying to jump. And of course, as Michael mentioned, you start blurring, you start using perturbation, and you run into transparency concerns. And oftentimes we get the question, what are you hiding as it relates to the data that we are publishing? So it's not a question of hiding, it's a question of protection. And not all audience members see those two things distinctly. Most of them just assume it's one and not the other. So that is, I tried to give you just a brief insight. I know this presentation and the notes will be available for you to download as a part of this webinar. And of course, my contact information is actually in the presentation. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can certainly email me or call me, and we can talk through some things. I'll be happy to help you as best I can. And if I don't know it, then I will punt to the U.S. Department of Ed and PTAC faster than the Eagles kicker. And that's it. Amelia?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adrian. We're going to move over to the Q&A now. In the chat box in Zoom is the link to the Google Doc where you can enter any questions you have. We already have several questions, very excitingly. So to begin with, either for Michael or Adrian, but most likely for Michael on this one, how does the reasonable person in the school community standard definition of PII differ from a reasonable person standard on its own? Is it intended to be a higher standard?
So that's an excellent question. And I think you can consider it a higher standard, largely because the in the school community piece of that, the reasonable person in the school community, I think references the idea that there is going to be some basic information available about students. You're going to know who the students in a subgroup in a school are. You're going to know kind of contextual information about those individuals. And that contextual information can often help you re-identify individuals. And one of the best examples of that we see with quite a lot of regularity is when you're talking about discipline data. So many states publish discipline data on their school report cards: number of suspensions, number of expulsions, number of incidents. These are the sorts of things that are often reported in the news, that you'll see a local news story about an incident that occurred at a school. There might be some information published in that article, contextual information about the event. And then knowing that a school had an expulsion, if you knew who was involved in the event through that news article, and you know that the incident resulted in a student getting expelled, well, then you now know that little Johnny, who was involved in the incident, was the one who got expelled. You've learned something from his education record. So I think the idea about the reasonable person in the school community is that you're combining, okay, reasonable methods of attempting re-identification and some general awareness of context and information that's commonly known to the individuals in the community. Now that said, so the in the school community portion of that raises the standard somewhat, but I think the reasonable person component of that is a fairly loose standard as well. Largely because so my boss at the U.S. Department of Education is our chief privacy officer, and she frequently reminds me that I am not a reasonable person. I am a statistician by training. I do disclosure avoidance work quite extensively. I can go into most state report cards and break them, but I am not a reasonable person. So just because I can break a table, just because I can break a state's disclosure avoidance method, doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't met that reasonable person standard, because sometimes it takes a lot of effort, and you have to build in that understanding of the effort involved and the sophistication of essentially the reverse engineering as part of that. FERPA has this reasonable person in the school community standard, which differs from the confidentiality standard you see in a lot of other laws, largely because we recognize the fact that it's important to get this data out there. And if we adopted a really strict standard of confidentiality, the challenges of de-identification would make it impossible to publish any data. So it really is, it's a balancing act here. The school community portion of the definition may make it slightly harder, but at the end of the day, you also have to remember, we're talking about reasonable people here. Can somebody reasonably re-identify or not?
Great, thank you, Michael. Next up, we have, what are the responsibilities or the standard for companies to de-identify the student data they hold? I'm assuming either on their own or the sort of follow-up to that question is, what about when they are de-identifying the data or preparing it for reporting purposes on behalf of the school?
So I'll take that one as well, and then maybe Adrian, you can chime in with your own experience. But so it's important to remember, okay, so the requirement to de-identify data before you publish it is a requirement under FERPA. And FERPA applies to educational agencies and institutions. They are the regulated entities. So it is their responsibility to ensure that any data of theirs that is being published is being properly protected. So if you are a company or a vendor working with a school or working with the state, and they have provided you data and are telling you, okay, publish this data, or they're permitting you to publish this data once it's properly de-identified, it's that educational agency or institution that is responsible for determining the appropriate threshold, for determining the sufficiency of your methods. If you were working for them and you publish data that is re-identifiable and it leads to a FERPA violation, it's ultimately going to be the school that is responsible there. So the first thing that I would say to any third party, be it a research organization, a company or vendor that's being contracted to the agency, is check with the educational agency that's disclosing the information to you and make sure that your methods are approved by them. Because we at the U.S. Department of Education may think that a certain amount of protection is sufficient, but if the school wants more protection, that is their prerogative. If the state wants more protection, that is their prerogative. And oftentimes there are state laws that require additional protections above and beyond FERPA. So the absolute first thing would be your methodology has to be satisfactory to the disclosing educational agency or institution, first and foremost, and it has to be satisfactory under the law.
Yes, from a state perspective, we don't govern the conversations that are had between LEAs and their vendors, other than to say that everyone in the education space is bound by the law, right? So they have to follow the FERPA guidelines and protect data, student privacy in their interactions with their vendors, whether they use the Department of Education in Delaware as an intermediary or not, right? So as it relates to de-identification with vendor data, when we get it, we take on the ownership of FERPA responsibility for data that we receive when we disclose it. And so if they have chosen to de-identify the students before they send us the data, and we cannot match the students in our master person index, then the data comes into the system and it is not matched. And then, of course, we follow all the FERPA guidelines and we choose to then publish that data. And so we do get vendor data as it relates to assessment scores in some ways, and then publish that data in aggregate format to the public. And then we have a private user protected, security siloed environment for LEAs to go look at their own students' data. And in that case, that data is then connected with enrollment and all kinds of other data as well. But as a general rule, we stay out of the conversations between LEAs and their vendors, other than to say, you must follow FERPA, you must follow the law when you decide to publish information about your LEA to your constituents.
Thanks, Adrian and Michael. Sort of a follow-up to that question, what is the data de-identification requirement, if any, for a company to use in order to improve their own product or for other internal uses?
So I can take that one as well. And then Adrian, you can chime in for Delaware. So this is also a complicated question. So some of that is going to depend on how the entity received the information in the first place. Most of the situations that we see, a third-party vendor or company is going to receive information from a school or a school district under FERPA's school official exception. And under that exception, the company essentially becomes a school official, and they must be under the direct control of the school or district with regards to their use and maintenance of those data. So the first question that a company would have to ask is, does their agreement with the school or district permit them to use these data for product development? Many of the terms of service or contracts that are signed will include a provision to that effect, either permitting it with certain restrictions in place or not permitting it at all. If it is permitted, if the school under as their mechanism of exerting direct control permits a vendor to use data for product development, that then may be permissible in identifiable form. For example, if you're contracting with a company to provide email services, for example, that company may need to use identifiable information as part of its malware protections, malware tracking, or spam prevention. And that may be a legitimate use because it's part and parcel of the service they are providing to the school. If, on the other hand, the vendor wants to use student information for product development, let's say to improve their algorithms for personalized learning or to develop another educational product, and the school permits them to do that, but only in de-identified form, for example, well, then the vendor would need to properly de-identify any of that data or metadata before they could use it for that. So again, under the terms of their agreement with the school, they would then need to de-identify it. And what is required for that, what is required as part of that de-identification, is going to vary substantially based on the nature of the data in question. Some metadata are very easily de-identifiable. Some data are very difficult to de-identify. And that's all going to relate back to how many data points are there about the student and how can they be combined to triangulate back to an individual. If you're just looking at login information and like time and date of login, and you've stripped all the identifiers off, that may be very difficult to do, to re-identify. If you're looking at content of student work, where they're doing narrative essays, for example, even if you've stripped off student name, there may be a lot of information, a lot of personal information that students have included in that content that could then point back to the student. So the first thing you'd have to look at there, once you've made sure that de-identification is permissible under your agreement with the school, is, okay, what are the data elements? What is the risk of re-identification? And then you select your methods to properly de-identify it. And again, make sure that those methods are satisfactory from the educational agency or institution's perspective, because again, they're the ones who are governing that relationship. They're the ones who have to make sure that the de-identification meets their standards as well as federal standards.
Yeah, Michael summed that up really, really well. We don't do a whole lot of publishing of data on LEA's behalf where we would certainly then step into this these very muddy waters. But from a state perspective, if we're engaging in work for a vendor on behalf of an LEA, then the three of us get together and confirm that the de-identification standards and techniques being used are satisfactory, so that when we receive the data, we don't have to do too much more as it relates to providing techniques on top of it in order to be able to disclose it.
And I'll add in, particularly from metadata, we get the metadata question a lot, and de-identification of metadata. We have a discussion of that and the issues involved from the legal side, not from the statistical side, included in our 2014 guidance on education technology. It's entitled Protecting Student Privacy While Using Online Educational Services, Requirements and Best Practices. We published that in 2014. It's on the studentprivacy.ed.gov website, and there's a whole discussion in there about the identification of metadata.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael and Adrian. Next question is somewhat related to this. Many teachers want to sign their students up for a free web service or an app, and in order to protect their students' privacy, they don't use the student's full name. Example, Dan S. or Smith D. as the username. Is this acceptable?
I'm going to give the answer to any FERPA question as an answer to this one, and that's going to be, it depends. Again, FERPA is very context dependent. At the end of the day, FERPA prohibits the disclosure of personally identifiable information from a student's education record to a third party without consent unless an exception applies. And there are a number of exceptions. I talked about the school official exception earlier. If the teacher is signing students up for a service and not providing any personally identifiable information as part of signing them up, let's say completely anonymized user accounts, and when the student is using that service, they're not providing any additional personal information. Like, let's say it's really just signing in to be able to watch online tutorials, and there's no input of student information as part of the student's interaction. So anonymized user information and no student input of information through their use of it, then that may be permissible because there would be no disclosure of PII from the student's education records. If, however, the teacher provides an anonymized login like student 123, but then as part of the student's use of that, they're taking tests or quizzes and getting graded, and it's maintaining information for the school as part of the education process, well, then that information linked to a student user account, even if anonymized, may be identifiable, and that may be part of the student's education record. That's going to depend a lot on context and the specifics of the situation. I would say if you're collecting information from the students as part of their classroom activity, even with an anonymized login, you may be venturing into the FERPA realm. And I would say if you have questions, send them in to the Student Privacy Help Desk, and we can evaluate based on the specifics of that situation. Otherwise, I would say it depends.
Thanks, Michael. We're going to go on to the next question just because we are almost out of time. So can you go over some basic information on how to de-identify individual student data in order to protect students' identity as they utilize online resources for educational purposes? What are the best practices regarding de-identifying student data, and what should educators do to make sure they are protecting student identities and student-generated content?
Wow, that is there is a whole lot in that question. I don't think there's no succinct answer I can provide to that. Again, like the very first questions that you'd have to ask is, okay, what information is being provided? What information is being collected? Is it being done under one of the FERPA exceptions? If so, what are the restrictions that are being placed through that, i.e. how is direct control being exercised by the school, if it's a school official relationship? Assess the re-identification risk based on the information being provided. Look at the vectors that re-identification could happen through, and then select a method or methods that could de-identify it, either by stripping data elements off, doing some small degree of perturbation to the data, aggregating across a large number of schools. Again, there's going to be a variety of things you can do there. There's no succinct answer, but I'd say send the specifics of what you're interested in to us, and we can advise in a more concrete way.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is we've had conversations with our LEAs, and as a general rule, we tell them to send as little as possible to identify the student, and know whatever system you're about to upload this data into, know what data they're collecting. That's number two. So number one, send as little as possible, send as little data as possible to identify a student. Number two, know what data is being collected in this system that you are about to engage with. And number three, are you planning on doing any reporting of this data afterwards? And so if you're going to publish or report out on the results or the progress of the system that you're uploading these students into, then yes, everything that Michael said is a sticky wicket, and I suggest you get on the phone or email somebody and have a deep conversation. But if you are using it for operations purposes and you're not planning on publishing this data in any way, shape, or form, then the conversation, you can relax your shoulders a little bit as you have these conversations, still having privacy conversations about where is the data being stored, how's the data being protected, how's the data being, what are your measures and protocols for data breaches. I mean, you have to have those conversations regardless, right? But if it's about de-identifying students, send as little as possible, find out what they're collecting, and know if you're reporting.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions. One of the major de-identification challenges for LEAs and SEAs is dealing with public disclosures from the Department of Ed and trying to make sure that the data the state has put out doesn't allow for re-identifiability when combined with a federal data report. How do you deal with that? I would imagine both Michael and Adrian have some thoughts here.
So that is a major challenge, and it's one that we grapple with quite a bit at the U.S. Department of Education. Our disclosure review board that reviews the privacy protections for all of our public data releases of program data. We've got a separate DRB for the statistical collections that the National Center for Education Statistics releases. But for the program data, our DRB considers this issue quite substantially. And it's definitely an imperfect situation because, again, as I mentioned, anytime multiple entities are releasing the same data, there is risk that one release could impact another. I think a good example of how we've tried to address that, and we address it on a case-by-case basis depending on the collection, but one good example is a few years back when we started releasing the school level assessment data, so math and reading assessment proficiency by essentially percent proficient, percent not proficient by race, ethnicity, and gender and the other subgroups. We adopted a methodology that included blurring of all of the data, not just for small cells, not just for small subgroups. We included uncertainty essentially in all of the data we were reporting. Everything was reported in ranges or with top or bottom codes. The idea there being we were able to get a substantial amount of data out there, but in such a way that because there was uncertainty built in through those ranges, we decided that there was little risk. Not no risk, because again, disclosure avoidance, there's never any perfect solution, but there was substantially reduced risk that what we were publishing could be combined with state data to undo protections that the state was implementing themselves. Again, it's not a perfect situation, particularly with the proliferation of different methodologies across states. But we adopted methods that we thought were sufficient to meet that reasonable person standard in the data that we released.
From a state perspective, we have trouble getting our wires crossed as it relates to multiple outlets for public reporting. And I can only speak for Delaware, but I've had conversations with other federal reporting coordinators, and they have this problem as well. So in general, we trust that the feds are gonna do their data disclosure due diligence on the data that we report. I think the major key that we do have, though, is that generally states have different business rules for reporting the same data that they report to the feds. And so, for example, our assessment proficiency business rule is different than our accountability proficiency business rule. And that the business rule differences affect the denominator of the percentage. And so when we report out, it is possible that what we report to our state constituents is different than what we report to the feds. And so having a data disclosure technique it'll be difficult to be unwound using federal data to unwind it. It would be much more likely that you could or reverse engineer or re-identify data using several state reports than it would be to use a state report and cross-reference it with a federal report.
I would also add as another factor there, so the U.S. Department of Education and PTAC, we do not have the authority to tell states, you must use this methodology to protect your data. The requirement under the law is you must protect the data. How you choose to do that is a matter for your own policy decisions. That said, we are working on developing recommendations and kind of detailed instructions that SEAs in particular can follow to protect their data as options. Essentially, we have guidance that we're in the process of developing. We hope to get it out in the next several months. That would be a few methodologies that you could use in relatively easy to follow step-by-step instructions that, should you choose to, would meet our requirements and would bring state reports that are generated using those methodologies in line with the methodologies that we employ ourselves at the department, and further reduce the risk of re-identification from differing reports.
Wonderful. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much to our fantastic speakers. Thank you to all of you who called in to hear about de-identification on a Friday, as well as those of you who joined us on Wednesday. As previously mentioned, if you can please email me if you did not register through Zoom, if you would like a copy of the notes, slides, and recording of today's webinar. And we hope for all of you in SPS working groups to talk to you all next month. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful rest of your Friday.
Thank you very much.